Of course, I just kicked the tripod, so I probably look like I'm sitting someplace different. This girl's nuts, but it's fine. I highly what my number one pick is, but I will say... Hi everyone, it's Audrey and welcome back to Chapter and Converse, and welcome to part 2 of my Best of the Rest 2019 books that aren't thrillers. So I obviously started to film this video and realized as I was getting into it that it was going on forever and ever, and decided to just chop it up into 2 bits. So without any further ado, I will link part 1 in case you guys haven't caught it, so you can get caught up there, and then let's get into part 2, which is all of my books that do not fit into the mystery, thriller, suspense category that I loved in 2019. The next book I read was also a completely pleasant surprise that only came on my radar because Goodreads told me that Taylor Jenkins Reid recommended it, and it is Evie Drake Starts Over by Linda Holmes. Sorry, I'm rocking the book around. And I just finished this a couple weeks ago, and this is contemporary. You have 2 people who basically are at a crossroads in their lives and are trying to figure out kind of what their what next is. So here we go with another trope, much like London is the best city in America. And Evie she's sort of a new widow. Her husband died a year ago. She's in like her late 30s, I believe. And her husband was a doctor, had a heart attack kind of out of nowhere, dies. Like page 1, I'm not spoiling anything. This is the entire premise of the book. And she is still coping with the aftermath of that. And she doesn't really leave the house. She very much keeps to herself, and everyone thinks she's just really grieving for her husband, and she basically is content to let people think that. But she's got some other stuff going on. And her best friend Andy, who is divorced, dad of 2, who lives in town with her, is kind of trying to help her through this. And at the same time, Andy has a friend named Dean, who used to be a pitcher for the New York Yankees, but he basically lost his pitching arm and has a bad case of the yips and has been let go of his contract and basically kind of like laughed out of New York City, and he just needs to get away and figure out, you know, can he pitch again? What comes next for him? And Evie needs some money and has an apartment in her house. Dean needs to get out of town. Andy connects them, so Dean winds up moving up to Maine. And this is very much a story of, again, these 2 people who are at a crossroads in their lives, and neither of them want to talk about the number one thing that is their, you know, problem. So dead husband and inability to pitch. And they come together and sort of help each other through the next year of their lives and kind of figure out who they are. They sort of force each other to confront things in their lives they don't want to confront. We get this very unlikely friendship between the 2 of them. And what I loved about it is not only is the writing like whip smart and funny, laugh out loud sometimes, and I 100% cried a couple of times reading this book. The writing in and of itself is just incredible, I think. What I love about Evie and Dean is that they felt, again, so authentic to me in that, you know, they are sort of all these wonderful things, but at the same time, they make bad choices, they say awful things, they sort of do ugly things, they don't always act the way you want, they don't always say what you want. People, you know, can be disappointing and hurtful, and, you know, sometimes you're trying to help and sometimes it's pushing somebody away, and it's just sort of a lot of the complexities of any kind of friendship, any kind of relationship. And maybe you think you're doing the right thing and it's not what that person wants from you, or vice versa. So I really just enjoyed watching this friendship unfold and watching sort of how they dealt with their problems. And sometimes you put that on other people or take it out on other people. But again, it felt very authentic to me. I just loved it. I thought it was a really well done book. Wholly laughed out loud at certain points, and 100% cried at points too. And I just thought it was so well done and just such, again, a pleasant surprise that I didn't see coming. Just hugely, highly recommend this book. I thought it was great. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. So my favorite books of 2019 would not be complete without me talking about The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. And I did a whole dedicated video to this one too. This is the sequel to A Handmaid's Tale. This is 30 years in the making. I loved it. There's so much mixed bag on this book, and I couldn't care less what any of the reviews are. I read The Handmaid's Tale in college. It was my first exposure to Margaret Atwood. I found that book to be life-changing in so many different ways, from not just the content and concept of the book, which blew me away, but Margaret Atwood as a writer. I took it, or I read it in a sophomore English class, and I feel like it was one of those sort of defining moments where I was like, holy crap, there's so many amazing books out in the world that I have no idea exist. And it is a book that has always stuck with me. It is a book that has always, like, I've always gone back to it, so to speak, and it opened up just very much a whole new world for me. And then, like many people, I devoured the Handmaid's Tale TV show with Elizabeth Moss and so many more, and loved it. And then word came out that this book was happening, and I loved it. Did all my questions get answered? No. Did I wish certain characters' stories were told in this? Yes. I think Margaret Atwood was hard-pressed to write a sequel that was going to satisfy everyone, and this could have gone in so many different directions, and I was so curious to see what she was going to do, and I loved it. I love what she did. It wasn't, the ending was a little bit predictable to me, and that's fine. I'm okay with it. We get the perspective from 3 different women who are somehow connected to the original handmaid, Offred, and we see a different perspective, or we see their perspectives of where we're at in Gilead 10 years later, right? 15 years later. Girl, you should know this. And it's so interesting to me. And I will say one of the things I struggled with is one of the perspectives humanized someone from the original Handmaid's Tale that initially I wasn't really interested in having humanized to me. And I was fine feeling how I felt about her in the first book, and that I didn't like her in the first book. And part of me was sort of like, oh, okay, now you're trying to like redeem this character. So originally when I was reading this, I was a little bit resistant to one of the characters, but I wound up understanding why Margaret Atwood did what she did. And then there's 2 characters who we know about in the first book, but we don't get sort of much on them, and we get them here. So anyway, I'm being cryptic in case you haven't read it, and I don't want to give anything away, as always. But I loved it. I love that she wrote another book. I loved that there was so much love and appreciation for what she did in The Handmaid's Tale and how timely it continues to be. Frighteningly timely The Handmaid's Tale continues to be in this day and age. And how, again, she said when she wrote The Handmaid's Tale, she didn't write a book about anything that didn't happen somewhere in history. She just pulled it all together and made it happen in the present day. And that's what makes it so frightening. So I think it's great. I think if you're a Margaret Atwood fan, it is a worthwhile read. I think if you're a Handmaid's Tale fan, it is worth reading. This has nothing to do with season 2 or 3 of the TV show. It's completely independent. Again, this is 15 years later. There's nothing from that's in this. Season 1 of The Handmaid's Tale is very much the original book, The Handmaid's Tale. Everything after that is different. And I thought it was great. I found it to be, hopeful and heartfelt and frightening, and at times difficult to read. And there's violence in it that is disgusting. And there is behaviors that are horrible, much like in the original Handmaid's Tale. And again, the ending was a little bit predictable in some ways, but I don't even care because I loved it, and I'm happy that this happened, and I'm so happy that I read it. Okay, so we're in the home stretch here, and I have 6 books left to talk about, but they are by 2 authors, both of who I discovered in 2019. And if you have followed me at all, you know 100% what's about to happen here. But I couldn't pick. I couldn't Sophie's Choice the situation and get it down to just one by each. There's just too much to say. So I'm going to try and keep it brief, as if. But I just love. So the first book I read by Taylor Jenkins Reid this year is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And I loved this book. This book blew me away, took me by surprise, is 100% a BookTube made me do it kind of a book. Everyone was talking about it. I poo-pooed it at the beginning as like, historical fiction, this is not for me, this saga, this lady, blah. And much like with my YA stuff, I like got over myself, got it, started to get the FOMO feels, so needed to know what it was all about. Like, I laughed, I cried, it was better than Cats. Holy crap, you guys, this book is amazing. And it is social commentary, it is friendships, relationships, it is being a woman in a modern day, it is being a woman struggling for acceptance, for authenticity, for being able to be who you are, for the pressures of the world around you, for making bad choices, for making good choices, for doing anything and everything for the people that you love, for having no idea what is going on behind the scenes with someone, for sacrifices that you make for people that you love, for ambition and drive, family, love, motherhood, being the daughter, saga, being the wife, all of it. I mean, it is just so much. There is great representation in this book. There is the most amazing research that literally makes you feel like Evelyn is an actual movie star from the 50s. I feel like I am in Hollywood. I am living her life. You want to look her up. You want to see her movies. You want to look up her page on Wikipedia. You know, it is a well-known fact that like a top search is like, is Evelyn Hugo a real person? And she's not. Taylor Jenkins Reid is such an incredible writer and storyteller. I've raved about her on this channel all year long. I have done dedicated videos on her. I took an online writing class with her specifically about research, and her approach to her projects and her stories and her books is like no other. And the time that she puts into making everything so authentic, whether it is a dress that someone is wearing or a song that's on the radio or the car a person is driving or the perfume someone is wearing, is so much more than just Googling, you know, what was a popular perfume in the 60s. The thought that she puts into her characters and her stories completely blows me away as a reader and as a writer. I have such incredible respect for her, and her stories have moved me like no other author has in a really long time. And the only thing that competes with her as a storyteller is the next person I'm going to talk about. But I would say they are 100% neck and neck as my top books of the year and top authors of the year. So I loved Evelyn Hugo. I spent all of 2019 reading all of her backlist with the exception of one book, which I got for Christmas, which I'm going to read in 2020. But other Evelyn Hugo books that I loved, I thoroughly enjoyed all of them, but a couple that stood out. Maybe in Another Life also shook me to my core and made me cry like a baby. And this is a sliding doors type of story where Hannah, 29 years old, she goes back to LA where she's from. It is her first night back in town. She is living with her best friend who she went to high school with and her best friend's husband. And her best friend kind of calls up everybody from high school and they're all going to meet at a bar as kind of like a welcome home Hannah party. And one of the people who meets them at the bar is Hannah's ex-boyfriend, Ethan. And they broke up kind of right before Hannah went to college and haven't seen each other in 10 years. And what happens on the first night is Ethan asks Hannah to stay. And in one life she stays, and in another life she leaves. And what we wind up seeing in alternate chapters is how her life played out depending on which decision she made. And it's a very interesting story about, you know, destiny and how the choices you make affect your life, and sort of, are you always destined to sort of wind up in the same place, or does that decision completely derail a path that you were on and completely change the path of your life? So it's a very interesting thought about that and a very interesting story about that. And then it's also 100% about the complexities of friendships and relationships and family. And again, here comes the theme. Hannah is super lost. She's had a ton of jobs. She left New York for a specific reason. She's trying to figure out where she belongs when she gets back to LA. And it is a woman trying to find herself. So you guys can 100% see where my head was at this year. But I just loved it. I loved it. I did love one ending more than the other. I found them both completely satisfying. I just thought it was great. I thought it was absolutely tremendously great. And this is the book she wrote before Evelyn Hugo. So part of what's interesting to me is how I did read her first novel. You can see the progression of Taylor Jenkins Reid as a writer and as a storyteller, and as she takes different risks with how she tells her stories. So I thought that was completely fascinating. Another one, which I have it on my iPad, is Evidence of the Affair. And this was a novella she wrote. And it basically is in the 70s. And it is a woman who is, I want to say she's like in her husband's office or whatever it is, but she winds up finding a letter from a woman that her husband is having an affair with. And she decides to write to that woman's husband and basically says, hey, like, my husband's sleeping with your wife. Just wanted to let you know. And then the husband and wife who are being cheated on wind up developing a relationship through letters. So the entire novella is written in an epistolary format through their letters. And I just thought the format was genius, and I loved it. It is, I don't know if it's like 100 pages. It is like a one-sit kind of a thing. It feels very voyeuristic that you're reading other people's letters. And I thought it was so cleverly done. And there is, she wrote that between Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones. And there is a Daisy Jones Easter egg in Evidence of the Affair. But the last book I want to talk about is Daisy Jones, which I listened to on audiobook. Best audiobook of the year, hands down. Bar is raised so incredibly high. I followed along with the book so I could go through and underline and dog ear like I love to do. And this is another book that people either like loved it or didn't. I loved it. This is a fictional 70s rock band, The Six, and Daisy Jones is a singer-songwriter, and they wind up doing a collaboration. And then it's sort of about the year together where they make an album together, and they are top of their game. And one night they have a concert and they break up, and nobody knows why, and nobody's talked about it. And then it's like current day, they are all sitting down with a sort of behind the music Rolling Stone style interview, talking about what happened back then and why they broke up. And this is completely told in interview format, which is crazy genius, I think. Some people absolutely hate the format. Some people like it. Some people just didn't like the book. It is very 70s rock and roll scene. So there is sex and drugs and rock and roll and all of that. I thought it was like incredibly authentic to the time. Again, you feel like you're there. You feel like these are real people. There are song lyrics. You want to like pick up their albums. Taylor Jenkins Reid has like a Spotify playlist that goes along with this that was an inspiration for her, which is great. It's very Fleetwood Mac-y. There's a lot of inspiration you can see from bands of that time, and Taylor Jenkins Reid again talked about her research with Fleetwood Mac, but it's also, she read the Bruce Springsteen biography and the Eagles, and then a current band called the Civil Wars, where it was a man and a woman. They were not romantically involved, but they were sort of wrote these very intimate songs, and one day they just broke up and nobody knows why. And that was part of the inspiration as well. So I just thought it was great. And I think part of what I love about it is continuing to see her experiment with different ways of telling stories and taking risks with different ways of telling stories. But I loved it. And I would highly recommend the audiobook. There is going to be, I don't know if it's like an Amazon series or a Netflix series, but there is going to be a series coming out with this. I'm very curious to see how they're going to do it, and partly because I have Jennifer Beals' voice in my head as Daisy, because she's Daisy in the audiobook and Benjamin Bratt is in the audiobook, and I don't know that they are going to be the actors playing the characters, but I'm very curious to see it. I just thought it was great. I thought it was great. I cannot wait to see what she comes up with next, but hands down, Evelyn Hugo, completely opened up an entire world for me this year, and I am thrilled to bits that I picked this book up. I suspect most of you have figured out the last books that I'm going to talk about, and I would say tied for my number one spot with Taylor Jenkins Reid is Frederick Bachman. And I read Beartown in January of 2019. This was another BookTube made me do it, FOMO, what the heck is everybody else talking about? I need to know. I got it from the library. I wound up obviously buying my own copy of it because I needed to have it. And this book also completely shook me to the core from a story perspective, from a writing perspective, all of it. The sequel, Us Against You, was incredible. Second books sometimes don't match up, sometimes they disappoint. This book was so beautifully done. I am still semi-speechless over this book. And this is such a complicated story, yet such a simple story in so many ways. And I mean that in the best way possible. And this is about a high school hockey team who basically, we're in this small remote town and hockey is everything to them. They are a little bit run down, a lot industrial. There's not a lot of money. There is not a lot to this town. There is sort of these very wealthy families whose boys play on the team with the hopes of going pro. And then there are people who have lived in this town their entire life, most of them who played hockey growing up and did not become pro and are working, in the town and are still there. And everything revolves around these players. These players are gods to this town. And it is sort of before the big final game, and there's a huge party, and the captain of the hockey team sexually assaults the daughter of the hockey coach. And this becomes a town divided afterwards. And it is how people respond to the victim of the crime, how people respond to the perpetrator of the crime, who they believe, how the town turns on one another. It is this extended cast of characters, and a lot of people say that this is a slow burn, and it's fine that it's a slow burn because it needs to be, because you need to understand who all of these players are, literal hockey players, but players in the story. Because when the night of the party happens, that's sort of when everything turns, and it is how everyone is affected, from the families, from the friends, from the other players on the team, from the town itself. And it is this horrifying reaction to things. And I want to say I talked about this all the way back when I did my video reviewing this, because I was just so moved by this book, where it's so easy to sit here and say, oh, I would have done this, or I would have sided with this person. But it is as much a commentary on sort of this hero god worship and how important this player is to the town. And, if he is arrested or can't play, the implications that has to this town, and sort of the lengths people will go to preserve this guy who was accused of sexually assaulting this girl. And it is also about sort of how they treat the victim and victim blaming, and just people turning a blind eye to things, and who really knows what's going on, and who's going to tell the truth, and what people will do to shut other people up. And some of it is really disgusting behavior, and some of it is just beautiful, heartfelt, moving behavior of the risks and sacrifices some people will make and take to do the right thing, and how other people are doing what they think is right, even though you might not agree with it. So it's so complex. There's so many layers to it. I thought this was like a book about hockey, and there's so much happening in this book, but it is by far one of the best books I have read ever, never mind in 2019. And I am in love with Benji so much. He is my favorite character in both of these books. I just think he is such a beautiful character, and he is so imperfect in so many ways. But I just love him as a character. Anyway, there's so many beautiful quotes and lines to this, and the friendships that develop and the relationships. But again, there's this whole cast of characters, from the kids that are in high school, the hockey team, but sort of their parents and the coaches. And it is political ramifications to things, and sort of, like I said, you know, the survival of the towns, the different townsfolks, the people in a rival town, the rival hockey team. There's just so much going on and so many characters in this. So it's important to understand how everyone fits in, so that way you understand how people react sort of after the fact. And the writing is just absolutely beautiful. And there's so many lines I could quote from this book. And I think this is the one I read the last time too, because I just think it's so beautiful and it gives nothing away, so don't worry. But he writes, "The path back to normal life is indescribably long once death has swept the feet out from under those of us who are left. Grief is a wild animal that drags us so far out into the darkness that we can't imagine ever getting home again, ever laughing again. It hurts in such a way that you can never really figure out if it actually passes or if you just get used to it." I mean, honestly, you guys, his writing style is so beautiful, and he does this great repetition with certain words and certain phrases that come up again and again in a book. And there are like paragraphs that get repeated later to sort of reinforce what he's saying. And I just love stylistically how he writes. It's so beautiful. I'm flipping through it, and it's so beautiful. And I look forward to being able to read these books again soon, and to get even more out of them, because, you know, Benji and Maya, who is the girl who was assaulted, are such strong characters and kind of heroes in a certain way. But I think the strength that they have and the fight that they have in them and the resilience that they have in them, yet still the complete humanity to them, is just so beautiful. But these books are heartbreaking and hopeful and difficult, but beautiful. And there's just so much. I cannot say enough about it. So honestly, I can't pick between the two. So top 2 books of the year for me, 100%. In the best of the rest category, Taylor Jenkins Reid and Frederick Bachman. I recommend all of these books with all of my heart, but these in particular, if you are really looking to feel everything deeply and be moved and touched and really think about some very complex characters and complex situations, I can't recommend these books enough. Just all of my heart, all of my love. These are my favorites of the year. So that does it for all things non-thriller that I have loved this year. And again, so many incredible discoveries, so many new writers, stories, people I can't wait to read more from. It just was such an incredible reading year, and I'm so excited about it. And I would love to know if you guys have read any of these books, or if any of these are your favorites, if any of these are intriguing to you now. But let me know what your favorite non-thriller book of the year was. I'm always looking for more, obviously, and 2020 is a long road ahead. So all the time in the world to read books, right? But let me know what you guys think. And thank you so much for watching and for being a part of the journey with me here. And I look forward to seeing everybody in the next video. So I will see you guys really soon. Bye, everybody.